you think about the profound influence of the Bible on the world, the way that it has shaped our culture, whether you're a follower of Christ or not, it's probably a good idea that you know at least what it says. It's going to be about us taking and reading the Bible. Welcome to the Take and Read podcast. Pastor Chad here, and back with me on screen and on audio is Parker Smith. How are you?
I'm doing great, man. Good to see you.
That's good. It's been a while, and it's not because we stopped being friends. I just want to assure everybody out there that Parker and I are still good buddies. We had some technical difficulties. You had to go through a season of, trial and error with your computer, but you used some of that Aggie engineering, you found your way through it, and here you are. You're on the other end.
That's right. I'm back.
You're back. Sweet. Well, there's much to catch up on, and we could probably just sit for a couple hours and you could tell me all the cool stories about David and married life and all that kind of stuff. But I'd love to kind of have you stand back for a minute and just reflect on the last year and a half, and kind of big brushstrokes of what God's teaching you in this season of life. What is it He's teaching you through His Word, through community, through life experience, through marriage, fatherhood, all the good stuff?
Yeah. Over the last year, we had our son David in January, and so that's been a radical shift in my life. And I don't know if I already said this the last time I was on the podcast, but one of the most profound things I had considered, especially right after he was born, was our relationship to God as adopted children and as His sons, and Him being our Father, and how He gives us that opportunity to have children and to be their Father. And so, I remember listening to us. I had a really good friend who just had a newborn at the time, and he was listening to a sermon by Mark Dever over at Capitol Hill Baptist Church. And he was saying how helpless we are and how our tender, loving Father cares for us. And I remember him saying that he looked down at his son just totally dependent on his father's care. And I just thought, I've never considered how gracious it is of God to let us experience that with our children so that we could better know Him. And then it just goes on and on of Him. What does it mean to give His son for us? I have a son. And so I consider what it would be like to lose David. And then how much more does He love us? So just that, you could just go through tangents of just, if you just sit there and meditate on, you as a Christian are an adopted son, and God is your good, loving Father. It's really cool to think about. And something that I've gotten to experience because I love David so much, and I know him, and he knows me, and he knows my voice, and I know everything about him,
Yeah, that's so cool. It's definitely eye-opening when you get to be a parent, and different stages bring different awareness. I'll tell you that much. I think you and I were talking just before we got on the call about, the things the stage that you're in with David, and you almost lament kind of that stage passing. And then I kind of chimed in and said, I'm at a particular stage with my kids where it's a new and it's a different stage. And I do think back to when they're younger. I was just actually talking with my daughter today about just recalling and remembering when she was just absolutely newborn and precious, and now to just see the different stages and just there's so much joy in each stage. But I lament that this stage is also passing soon. And it's that awareness that God has allowed us into this experience of parenting. And I think it awakens and kind of enables us in a lot of different ways to greater compassion and empathy and awareness. So it's cool that you're in this stage and you're walking through this time right now, and you and Amy get this gift of a child. That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So everything at Yee, you guys are still making the best hats and apparel out there. So that's still going good.
Yeah, everything's going good. Everything's going good over
Sweet.
at Yee. Yep.
Good. I'm wearing some fresh new drip from Yee right now. I got this cool new hat and sweatshirt, which I absolutely love. But I'm also at a stage now. Whenever I get cool new gear, I have children that are of the same size, and so they feel like that's also their gear too. So I have to be careful when I get new cool stuff in because it starts to disappear rapidly. So
That's
anyway,
right.
keep on keeping on, and it's super good to connect with you guys. What's church life been like for you guys? Since it's been a while since I caught up, and I think last time we talked, you had recently transitioned out of your internship in DC and back into life in Texas and Yee and Emmaus, and so what's if you were to give a 30,000-foot view of your church life and your family life, what does that look like right now?
Yeah, just looking to continue to be a faithful member, and the church is growing rapidly, which is not the goal. The main goal of the church is not to grow, of our church is not to grow numerically, but to have our current members grow spiritually. But for whatever reason in that area at this time, I think people are hungry for the Bible and a church that is preach, praying, and singing the Bible. And so the church has grown a lot. So it's been really fun to see lots of new faces, people who are coming in, sharing their testimonies, how that they were hungry for a church that was preaching the word, preaching expositionally, which is just a fancy word for meaning the point of the text is the point of the sermon. And so it's been really fun to see people who are hungry for the Bible come in and trying to care for them well. We lost an elder who moved to Washington, and then the elders nominated another guy to be an elder, and he got voted in a couple months ago. So we now have the lead pastor and then 3 other elders, and they're looking to add on another guy, like a staff pastor in the springtime. And everything's been good.
Cool. Tell me briefly, since this podcast is about taking and reading God's Word, how has your devotional life changed since in parenting and now that David becomes more and more vocal and mobile? Has that changed your cadence around God's Word and when and how you do devotions?
It really hasn't so far because David sleeps so well. He goes to bed at about 7:15 and then he sleeps till 7 a.m. He doesn't wake up in the middle of the night. And so Amy has shifted her time she wakes up at 5:30 now, and then she does her devotional from 5:30 to 6, and then she goes and works out from 6 to 7. And then that way, by the time David's up, she's gotten in the Word for the morning, she's prayed, and she's gotten her workout in. And so that was something that she had to shift pretty dramatically since having David once her body was well enough to start working out again. And so I really admired her intentionality, because there's a lot of legitimate reasons to not be reading anymore because you're so busy and there's a lot going on. So it's been really cool to see her take the initiative to shift from waking up at 6:45 and then working out later in the morning she shifted to 5:30. So now I stay at the house from 5:30 to 7, and I just read and do my quiet time while she's at the gym, and then I leave at 7 to go work out.
Right on.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, let's jump into the text here, my friend. What do you say?
Let's do it.
We have been making our way through the book of Acts. So I don't know if you have been tracking, but we're about to launch into Acts chapter 24. So by way of a little bit of context, we have been journeying with Paul. And what has happened is that he has returned to Jerusalem after a period of time, and the Spirit of God had warned through a couple of different brothers and sisters that he was going to face physical persecution in Jerusalem. But he understood that was not that didn't mean that he wasn't supposed to go. It was just a preparation that this is what's going to happen. And so sure enough, there are some Jews from Asia that stir up quite a bit of problems and start accusing him of various things. And he goes to, he's arrested by the tribune, a Roman official who, is trying to do right by keeping the peace in the area. And so looking to flog him, but that's when Paul makes it conveniently known that he's a Roman citizen, and he's like, hey, is it still okay for you guys to do this since I'm a Roman citizen? And they're like, oh, no, it's not. So then all of his, the potential interrogators, the Roman centurion, even the tribune kind of realize, oh man, this is a bad deal. So they're getting ready to, release him. But then a plot is discovered actually by Paul's nephew. And so you have this interesting experience where you realize Paul has a nephew in Jerusalem. And the nephew makes it known to Paul. Paul has him make it known to the tribune that there's this assassination plot that's been hatched by at least 40 Jews or Jewish men. And so the tribune decides, hey, we're going to send you over to the governor Felix, and he's going to have to decide this matter. So he's basically punted Paul to this other Roman official, this governor in the area that is going to now hear this issue and try to determine what's going on and why Paul has made these people so mad. And so he sends over a couple hundred guards on horseback with spears, gives him protection, and that kind of finishes out chapter 3, where he's now being held and guarded for safety reasons, he being Paul, and is now about to appear before Felix. And so what we'll read is Acts 24, and we'll go 1 through 21 and see what we see as we read through this. Sound good?
Yeah, great.
All right, here we go. Jumping into Acts 24, starting in verse 1. And after 5 days, the high priest Ananias came down with some elders and a spokesman, one Tertullus. They laid before the governor their case against Paul. And when he had been summoned, Tertullus began to accuse him, saying, since through you we enjoy much peace, and since by your foresight, most excellent Felix, reforms are being made for this nation, in every way and everywhere, we accept this with all gratitude. But to detain you no further, I beg you in your kindness to hear us briefly, for we have found this man a plague, one who stirs up riots among all the Jews throughout the world, and is a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. He even tried to profane the temple, but we seized him. By examining him yourself, you will be able to find out from him about everything of which we accuse him. The Jews also joined in the charge, affirming that all these things were so. And when the governor had nodded to him to speak, Paul replied, knowing that for many years you have been a judge over this nation, I cheerfully make my defense. You can verify that it is not more than 12 days since I went up to worship in Jerusalem, and they did not find me disputing with anyone or stirring up a crowd, either in the temple or in the synagogues or in the city. Neither can they prove to you what they now bring up against me. But this I confess to you, that according to the way, which they call a sect, I worship the God of our fathers, believing everything laid down by the law and written in the prophets, having a hope in God, which these men themselves accept, that there will be a resurrection of both the just and the unjust. So I always take pains to have a clear conscience toward God, both God and man. Now after several years I came to bring alms to my nation and to present offerings. While I was doing this, they found me purified in the temple, without any crowd or tumult. But some Jews from Asia, they ought to be here before you and to make an accusation, should they have anything against me, or else let these men themselves say what wrongdoing they have found when I stood before the council. Other than this one thing that I cried out while standing among them, it is with respect to the resurrection of the dead that I'm on trial before you this day. All right, we're going to stop there. So we have kind of three phases to this section, it seems like. And so we just want to make sure we understand all that's happening, all the activity, who's there, what's happening. And so kind of, as best you can, in brief, describe who's there, what's the scene.
So we have Paul, and you said that he's on trial, essentially?
He's not on trial, but he's been brought before the governor to kind of better understand what are the accusations made against him. So I don't know that it's a formal trial, per se.
Okay. So we have him being essentially questioned. It says Tertullus began to accuse him. So we kind of have the accusation. Would that be considered part one here, you think?
Yeah, I think you have part one would be kind of that we're given information as to who's all going to be there. So rather than it being these 40 men that are from Asia that are Jews, we have Ananias, who's the high priest. He brings some elders and a spokesman, Tertullus. This is the first time we've met Tertullus. And what's interesting, if you go back to chapter 23, you read in verse 12 that the Jews made a plot and bound themselves by an oath to neither eat nor drink until they had killed Paul. There were more than 40 who made this conspiracy. They went to the chief priests and elders and said, "We've strictly bound ourselves." So there's this separate group that's gone before the chief priest and the elders, and essentially most likely Ananias and maybe even Tertullus who was there. But there are these men that are like, we're doing this, and we're not going to eat or drink. We're basically going to let ourselves die if we don't kill Paul. And so now it's this interesting thing where it's now become this burden of the leadership of the Jews in Jerusalem. And so you have 5 days later, a week almost, the high priest Ananias with some elders, spokesman Tertullus, they all convene with the governor Felix in his quarters to give their case against Paul. So it's almost kind of this, if I were to see it in a movie, there'd be this kind of scene where you see all these different characters and there's quick bios about them as they enter into this kind of council room or before the governor. And so that seems to be scene one. And then the second kind of phase to this would be when Tertullus gets up to speak and he kind of frames the accusation.
Okay.
Yeah. And then the third part being Paul responding to that accusation.
Okay.
Yeah, you have, again, we don't have a lot of information about this Tertullus other than maybe he was like legal counsel. Maybe he was a kind of in modern language, he was kind of their legal representation or their hired spokesperson who was maybe familiar with or had experience in, coming before the governor, kind of knew the protocols, maybe knew the best way to kind of approach this thing. Maybe he was like an attorney and kind of knew how to frame it in a way that would get a ruling in their favor or get the governor to kind of lean their direction. You don't really know. That's all kind of speculation, but it's interesting that they have this guy that they've named, like he's our official spokesperson and he's going to speak on our behalf. And so he clearly has some sort of training or reputation for kind of handling himself or having some sort of experience or particular savvy when it comes to this situation. So he gets up, and you can see within the way that he frames this, because he does frame it, he does kind of cast this in a particular way in order to kind of maybe make it an obvious decision for Felix to side with them. You see, he kind of butters him up at first, right? Starting in verse 2 and then, or the second part of 2 and then in 3. He's like, yeah, man, Felix, ever since you've been the guy in charge, things have been so good. I just can't tell you how much we appreciate you. You're the best. He's like, the reforms you've made for this nation, how much peace we've enjoyed because of your foresight. Like, you've done all these things and you've made all these reforms, and we're just so grateful, right? In every way and everywhere, we accept this with all gratitude. But we don't want to bother you any further, and so we just beg for your kindness to hear us just briefly. And this man right here, and so you kind of see him kind of, pointing to Paul, this guy over here, he's like a plague, all right? You've done such a good thing to make this such a happy, healthy place. And this guy over here, he's a plague, one who stirs up riots among all the Jews throughout the world and is a ringleader to the sect of the Nazarenes. And just to kind of, I think to shed some light on that, the idea that the accusation of a riot, like that was like one of the things that the Roman Empire tried to avoid at all costs. Like you can read back to, I think it's in chapter 20 or chapter 18. There's this passing comment that's made about Priscilla and Aquila in chapter 18 of the book of Acts. And it talks about when Paul met Priscilla and Aquila in Corinth. The reason why they were in Corinth, because they had recently come from Italy. This is chapter 18, verse 2. Recently had come from Italy, and it was because they were kicked out of Italy, most likely Rome, because the Emperor Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave, because, in verse 4, had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome because they were causing particular riots or something like that. When you read, there's a historian, Suetonius, I believe is his name. He identifies that the Jews in the first century were kicked out of Rome because they had created and started these riots, presumably around an individual named Christus. And so you start to understand that there are these riots that are starting to happen throughout the Roman Empire, especially in Rome. And so when this guy, Tertullus, comes in and is like, yeah, this guy's a plague, this Paul, he stirs up riots among the Jews throughout the world and is a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. He even tried to profane the temple, but we seized him. So he's being characterized as this worldwide menace, a plague to the Roman Empire and the peace of Rome, or the Pax Romana. This, the idea that there's this peace over the whole empire. And so this Tertullus has framed Paul in a very particular way, which is interesting, that he's this worldwide rebel rouser. And in contrast to when he starts out in verse 2, recognizing that, he's appealed to the reality that Felix is the bringer of peace. He's established peace in their region, in their nation, because of his great foresight, his great wisdom. And so he's this bringer of peace, and yet here's this guy in his midst that is causing riots, the opposite of peace. He's causing conflict. He's profaning the temple. He's causing the Jews to get stirred up, which would have been the number one motivation for Felix, would have been to maintain peace. So get rid of anything that would cause that to be compromised.
Which seems to be the trend. Which seems to be the trend from even what happened to Jesus. Of there's this accusation that you're disrupting the peace, you're causing conflict. Specifically, you're causing mobs or riots, and that's really the only appeal that you could make to authority of what a Christian is going wrong. or what a Christian is doing wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Because a follower of Christ is, going to be, they're not going to be raising up an army to kill people or be hurtful. They're going to be selfless. They're going to be loving others, but they're ultimately going to be loyal to Christ over any governing authority, if that governing authority is forcing them to be in sin. So I guess in some ways it is a threat to authority, but that just reminded me of the accusations of Christ that he was causing riots. He's a disruption to the peace. I would assume that after Christ died, that was the persecution of the Christians, that it's just a disruption of peace. And then, so that's kind of one is disruption of peace. And then number two is a culture that was primarily Jewish. They would view that ultimately as blasphemy, that, they accuse Paul here of profaning the temple, or some sort of profanity, or some sort of blasphemy or insulting to God, which would also disturb the peace.
Yeah, and it's fascinating. You highlight this word peace, and here Jesus is called upon his birth the Prince of Peace. Right, he is the bringer of peace, and so the word that's used here in the Greek is eirene, which relates to that Hebrew idea of shalom. And there are ways in which we can understand that range of meaning could mean absence of conflict, right? So that there's no physical violence, no disruption, but just everything's calm. That's one way to see peace. But in that Hebrew context, peace also took on this idea of something being made whole. So something that's been fractured or is in pieces is now been restored to wholeness and made whole. And it's interesting because the way of Rome was to just kind of maintain this sense of calm. Like that was their idea of peace. But the gospel comes in to make us whole. It means to where our hearts are broken and fractured, our relationship with God is broken and fractured, which means necessarily our relationships with mankind are fractured. And it's not until the gospel of Jesus Christ, until our hearts are made from stone into flesh, right, that we actually now have the ability to exercise peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control, love, these fruits of the Spirit that are the things that actually make for peace, not just this superficial kind of this surface calm when there's a total war raging underneath. But we want the surface, we want the superficial calmness. And it's like when Jesus comes into Jerusalem, Luke 19, he weeps. He weeps over the city. And the thing that he says, as he drew near to the city, he saw and wept over it, saying, "Would that even you," he's speaking to Jerusalem, "had known on this day the things that make for peace, but now they are hidden from your eyes." And so he sees the city and he weeps, because Psalm 122, the psalmist tells us that we're to pray for the peace of Jerusalem. And what Jesus recognizes in that, when he draws near to Jerusalem itself, that the only way of peace is through Christ, the Messiah, and they have rejected the Messiah. The reality of the Messiah is they're unable to see, and so because of that rejection, they won't know peace. And so it's interesting that this whole matter is about riots versus peace, and that Felix is the bringer of peace. Like, this is what Tertullus is saying, that because of your reforms and your insight and your leadership, Felix, you've brought about peace in Jerusalem, because that's where they are. They're in Jerusalem right now. And yet it's not Felix that brings peace, but the gospel of Jesus Christ that brings true peace. And Paul, as a messenger and apostle of peace, essentially, is being made and basically accused of bringing the absence of peace, even though that's all that he does bring. And it's through the resurrection, which is what he points to. If you look at the accusation is made that he's causing disruption, he's causing riots, he's a ringleader, he's even profaning the temple. And then Paul's response. What do you notice about Paul's response to those accusations?
Well, it's interesting that he denies, I noticed that he denied the accusations that he was, knowing that for many years you've been a judge, he says, I cheerfully make my defense.
Mm-hmm.
They did not find me disputing with anyone or stirring up a crowd, either in the temple or in the synagogues or in the city. Neither can they prove to you what they now bring up against me. So he in a way, he denies this inciting of riots that they're saying he's doing. He's like, I'm not trying to incite riots. I'm not trying to stir up crowds, and I'm not trying to, But then he does confess in a way which almost brings me back to Peter denying Christ in a time when he was accused. And I see Paul here almost like redeeming that moment as he like boldly, he says, that wasn't true, but let me confess something to you boldly on that stage. And it's just like, yeah, Paul.
Yeah, buddy. Like he didn't shy away. He didn't pull a punch.
Yeah, and but this I confess to you, according to the way which they call a sect. I worship the God of our fathers.
Yeah, it's interesting too. He's basically saying, I'm not inventing a new religion. I'm not profaning the temple. This is the faith of my fathers. And what he's essentially saying is, I believe in the Messiah. This is a continuation of everything that's been prophesied. This isn't a new thing. This is the continuation. This is the full revelation of what God has been revealing to us. And he then brings up the reality of the resurrection, which that was kind of what got him out of the pickle when this first started several chapters ago, in that he's got the Pharisees and the Sadducees are in the same room, and the Sadducees reject the resurrection. And so he sees that he's got this mixed group that that find him to be the common enemy. And so he throws out the idea of a resurrection. Well, then all of a sudden, the Pharisees are like back in his play, and the Sadducees are upset. And so now he's pitted these two groups together, and that's how he's kind of able to get out of it at first. But he then reminds in this hearing that the only thing that he can be accused of is proclaiming and accepting the resurrection, the hope in God, which is the resurrection. That's where the true hope is. And he says, and then he kind of recounts his history. After several years, I came to bring alms to my nation, to present offerings. While I was doing this, they found me purified in the temple. He's like, I didn't violate the temple. I didn't profane the temple. I'd purified myself. I'd gone through all of the ritual motions that I had to go through. And there was no crowd. There was no tumult. There were some Jews from Asia, and they ought to be here before you to make an accusation, because they're the ones that have the real problem. They're the ones that are all up in arms. It's not Tertullus. It's not the Jewish leadership. And and then he just explains the reason why they got upset with me. It's with respect to the resurrection of the dead that I'm on trial before you this day. The hope of the resurrection.
I didn't catch that the first time. That's a really good point, because, he's not saying like, but I do confess to you like that I'm a follower of this whole like brand new, like random thing. He's saying, I telling you that like I worship the God of our fathers, and I believe everything laid down by the law and written in the prophets. Like it's such a good point. He's not saying I'm not seeing anything new here, other than the fact that like, this is like, I believe what you guys believe. We're waiting for the Messiah, and I'm just telling you that he's here, and that this resurrection is here. So that's where he's like, that's where we verge off, like you said.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that's easy for us to maybe look back on in the New Testament or through the book of Acts and see, or just kind of not even consciously, but subconsciously, just imagine that the disciples had started a new religion, and that it was kind of this new thing. And it's certainly being accused of them. They're being called the Way, this, the sect of the Nazarenes, it's this offshoot of Judaism or something like that. But in their minds, what Jesus had done was he was the new covenant. He was the final revelation of God to this world. He was the ultimate that all the prophets had been anticipating and their forefathers had been anticipating. And so there was no kind of framework in their mind of starting a new religion. It was the continuation. And you see that because they would attend the temple daily. When they're in Acts chapters 1 and 2 and 3, it's like every day they're going through the motions. They're doing the same stuff they'd been doing their whole lives, going, worshiping, all of these things, but now with the understanding and the fullness of understanding that came through Christ Jesus. So, and that's what's interesting in this passage too, because they're being accused by Jews, and it's all of this started because there was this really upset group of Jews from Asia that were upset with Paul that he was teaching that the Gentiles didn't have to follow through on the law of Moses. And so that was really disheartening to them. And he's like, it's not about that. It's about the resurrection. It's about the hope of the resurrection. That's why I'm on trial. So he keeps the main thing. He doesn't pull punches. You see this just ironic kind of display and priority of peace, that while Jesus is the bringer of peace, the gospel is the bringer of peace, reconciling God and man, and also man and man, or humanity. And yet the Tertullus and these Jewish officials are crediting Felix as this kind of great peacekeeper, and that it's his job. He's been charged by the Roman emperor to maintain the peace. So there's this societal, political peace that he's supposed to maintain. But in all reality, that's just a veneer. That's just this superficial kind of appearance of peace that is equated to calmness, right? Political calmness, societal calmness, rather than upheaval. But just like when Christ was here, he's aiming at so much more than what's superficial or surface level.
Yeah, it's such a good point. I didn't think about that piece. Not only they're prioritizing that temporary visual piece just to avoid conflict based on what they see right in their own eyes, when they don't understand the most important aspect of that conflict is not between man and man. It's that they are enemies of God in that moment, that mankind's biggest problem, this is Christianity. Mankind's biggest problem is we look at God and we say, no, thank you. We would rather worship and serve the things of this world. And just like a good, just judge right here in Georgetown, Texas, doesn't let the guilty go unpunished, so God on the last day will not let the guilty go unpunished. And we are enemies of God because we have chosen against what is right. And so to get that peace with God, it comes only through Christ. And that's the gospel. That's why Christ came, is living the perfect life that we could never live, dying the death that we deserved, and paying off our fine, so that God could look at us and see Christ and fulfill his justice, without sacrificing the character of who he is as a good, just judge. And so that peace with God is the ultimate peace.
So good. So you stand back and you look at a text like this. You know, it's hard to put ourselves in that position. It's hard to put ourselves in first century Jerusalem as a Jew among Jews that's being accused by brothers and fathers, probably people that he knew well, given his previous stature within the Jewish community. And there's this, he laments for them, like he desires that his brothers and sisters would come to know the hope and the freedom of the resurrection. And yet they're the ones that are the most antagonistic and angry and just venomous towards him. And so you stand back and you look at a passage like this. What are some kind of primary takeaways? How do you walk in light of this truth today?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head with Paul's demeanor of lamenting for the spiritual state of his accusers and his enemies. And that he makes a logical case with them of the God that he's following, that he treats them with respect, and also that he is not ashamed of the gospel.
Mm-hmm.
Those are kind of like my initial takeaways of how he's treating an application of that we could take from somebody interacting with those who are accusing them of their faith, who are persecuting for their faith, or just questioning their faith. In general, is kind of that the practical logic aspect, the respect, and then the that unashamed demeanor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think to kind of expand on what you're saying, for me, the takeaway is that while it seems like Tertullus, Ananias, the elders, maybe even Felix at this moment, would be the opposition to Paul, I don't think Paul sees them as opposition. I think Paul sees things for what they are. I think Paul, when he traveled through Ephesus and saw the profound demonstration of the demonic that had been kind of animating the people there that were opposed to him, I think throughout this, especially from kind of his Hebrew worldview, he is very well aware of the demonic and the powers and the principalities of the air that stand opposed to Christ. And that's who Christ has ultimately defeated. And so anytime he comes up upon a human actor that is opposed to him, I don't think Paul sees that human as evil. I think he sees them as a puppet or a pawn in a much larger cosmic battle, and he doesn't make an enemy out of his mission field. We're going to see him continue to go, and he's going to be ushered into other courtrooms and other throne rooms, and he's going to try to persuade all along the way anyone that can hear him of the resurrection, of the reality of Christ. He's never going to pull back from that. And I think sometimes it's helpful to read the book of Acts and then jump over and read the book of Revelation, because whereas the book of Acts makes it look like a lot of human opposition is constantly kind of pushing against the gospel, what Revelation illustrates is that it is very much cosmic, supernatural, and demonic opposition that's simply manifesting in human actors. And I don't think he's buying into the facade of peace, and he's also not buying into the facade that these people are my true enemy. I think he sees beyond both of those. And I think that's a challenge for me, that, as we record this podcast, there's a very tumultuous USA that we live in politically, and there's a lot of kind of swirling around, and it's very easy to identify those people that maybe hold positions opposed to our own as just vile enemies. And just to recognize that, like, we're all ultimately enemies of God without Christ. And so if we are upset with somebody, the way that they're treating us or characterizing us, and they don't know the Lord, that their biggest problem is not with us. It's just not. I mean, they, like you said earlier, they're looking up and going to God, saying to God, no thanks, I'm good. And we should lament that. We should be disheartened by that and try to live in any way we can in order to lead them to the saving knowledge of Jesus Christ and the resurrection and the hope. Wow.
I think that's a great perspective. I think that's just a great perspective, just to end it on how you said that, is their biggest problem is not with you. So, like, Christian, if you're listening to this, and it's like from my own heart too, when you are getting severe pushback or tension or persecution for your faith, it's just good to just remember that you are not this person's biggest problem, and we should lament that, they have rejected God, and that, like you said, we tend to under spiritualize things, especially in America, even as Christians in a world that's so secular and anti-religion. To remember that, it's not a battle of flesh and blood, and Yeah, and it just kind of helps you like pull out of yourself to get personally offended for your faith. It helps me at least to just keep that in perspective.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Parker, thanks for jumping on with me today. I'm glad we navigated the technical difficulties because this was just a rich time. I appreciate you joining me. And I love getting to hear kind of, family life, David life. I love the stories. I love to hear how Amy's doing, getting her time in the Word and prayer, and just so excited to watch from afar as the Lord kind of grows your family and works within the context of the Smith family over there in Texas. For those that have tuned in, what you've observed, what you've listened in on are two guys that have encountered Jesus Christ, an encounter of which we hope to never recover from. And we believe that this text that we read today is the inspired and divine revelation of God. It is His word to us. This is communication from the Creator of the universe. And He has given us everything that we need for life and godliness right here in this text. And so we believe this to be true. And if we've talked about something that's provoked a question or a comments absolutely leave in the comment section of however you're listening to this or watching this podcast. As far as questions, if you have a question for me or for Parker, you can email me at takeandreadpodcast@gmail.com, and I'll get that question over to Parker or I'll answer it myself. But I want to encourage everybody out there to go take and read the Word of God. Blessings.